Hormuz doesn't have to close to lose its power. It only has to become replaceable. For decades, this narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman has been one of the world's most important energy chokepoints. Millions of barrels of oil and huge volumes of LNG pass through it every day. But now imagine something different. The world doesn't attack Hormuz. Ships don't stop sailing through it. Instead, countries spend years building pipelines, terminals, storage, new energy supplies, and alternative routes until one day, a crisis in Hormuz no longer means the same thing. At first, that sounds like freedom. Then something unexpected happens. The world discovers that it hasn't eliminated its dependence on chokepoints. It has simply spread that dependence across a much larger network. So if Hormuz really lost its strategic power, who would gain the power that replaced it? The reason Hormuz matters isn't that it's impossible to bypass. It's that, for now, there aren't enough ways around it. In 2025, nearly 20 million barrels of oil and oil products moved through the strait every day, roughly a quarter of global seaborne oil trade. Around 15 million barrels of that was crude oil and condensates. Then there is natural gas. About 1/5 of global LNG trade moved through Hormuz in 2025, with Qatar alone sending most of its LNG exports through the strait. That makes the geography unusually important. A tanker leaving the Gulf isn't simply choosing between two roads. For many exporters, there are very few practical alternatives. Saudi Arabia and the UAE already have routes that can bypass Hormuz, but existing alternative pipelines can handle only a fraction of the volumes normally moving through the strait. And that gap is the real source of Hormuz's power. Not the water itself. The lack of substitutes. Which means the world's relationship with Hormuz could change without anyone ever closing it. All it would take is enough investment to make the alternatives large enough, reliable enough, and cheap enough to matter. And that is where this hypothetical really begins. The first sign that Hormuz is losing its power would not be a dramatic shutdown. It would be construction. Pipelines stretching across deserts, export terminals expanding on coastlines outside the Gulf, storage tanks growing larger, and energy companies quietly signing contracts that give them options they didn't have before. Some of those escape routes already exist. Saudi Arabia can move crude across its territory toward the Red Sea. The UAE can send crude to Fujairah outside the Strait of Hormuz. But in this scenario, those routes begin to expand. And something subtle changes. A refinery in Asia that once had to worry about one narrow waterway now has another supply route. A government can hold more oil in reserve. A shipping company can plan around a disruption instead of simply hopping one never happens. The first few $1 billion of new infrastructure might not change much. But repeated across years, country after country, those investments begin adding up. Hormuz is still busy, still important, still carrying enormous amounts of energy. But for the first time, some of the world's biggest energy buyers have something they didn't have before. A choice. And choice is where dependence begins to weaken. But having an alternative route doesn't mean everyone suddenly escapes Hormuz. Some countries would get out much faster than others. Saudi Arabia could move more crude toward the Red Sea. The UAE could expand exports through Fujairah. Other producers could invest in storage, terminals, and routes that give their cargo more options. For them, Hormuz would slowly become less like a single exit and more like one option among several. But Qatar faces a different problem. Its LNG exports are heavily dependent on Hormuz, and there is no comparable pipeline carrying its gas directly to another coastline. So while one Gulf producer becomes more resilient, another can remain tied to the same narrow passage. And that creates a strange new competition. The question is no longer simply, can the world bypass Hormuz? It's, who can bypass it first? Because the countries that build alternatives early gain something more valuable than another shipping route. They gain bargaining power. Buyers have more choices, exporters have more flexibility, and the countries still dependent on Hormuz become relatively more exposed. For the first time, the strait is no longer affecting everyone equally. And that sounds like the beginning of the solution. Until you look closely at what those new routes depend on. The new routes solve one problem. Then they create another. A pipeline can bypass Hormuz, but it still has a fixed capacity. A new export terminal can move energy, but it can become a bottleneck of its own. Storage can buy time, but only until the tanks begin to empty. And shipping around one chokepoint can simply move the risk toward another part of the journey. This is where the idea of a perfect escape starts to fall apart. The world could spend decades building alternatives and still discover that energy security isn't about finding one magical route around Hormuz. It's about having enough different routes that losing any single one doesn't cripple the system. That changes the strategy completely. Instead of protecting one narrow passage at all costs, countries would start building a network of overlapping options, pipelines, ports, storage, tankers, different suppliers, and different forms of energy. And now something unexpected happens. Hormuz begins losing its power precisely because the world becomes less dependent on any single route. But the strategic power doesn't disappear. It spreads. And once it spreads, the map of global energy security starts looking very different. If this transformation continued for decades, Hormuz could remain busy while becoming less strategically decisive. That distinction matters. A route can carry enormous amounts of energy and still lose some of its leverage if customers have credible alternatives. A disruption would still raise prices, ships could still be delayed, governments would still watch the strait closely. But the calculation would change. Instead of asking, how do we keep Hormuz open at all costs, governments could ask, how much of this supply can we replace and how quickly? That is a very different kind of vulnerability. And it would create new winners. Saudi Arabia, for example, could become more valuable to buyers if expanded Red Sea routes gave its crude another way to reach global markets. The UAE could gain similar flexibility through Fujairah, where oil can reach the open ocean without passing through Hormuz. Meanwhile, major energy buyers with more suppliers would have something equally valuable, bargaining power. If one route became threatened, they could shift part of their purchases elsewhere instead of competing for the same limited pipeline or shipping capacity. But there would be no single replacement for the strait. There would be a network. And that may be the most important consequence of all. The world wouldn't escape strategic chokepoints. It would create a system where no single chokepoint has quite the same ability to disrupt the entire system. Hormuz would still matter, but it would no longer sit at the center of the map. Hormuz doesn't lose its strategic power because ships stop passing through it. It loses power when the world no longer has to depend on it. That distinction changes everything. For decades, the strait's influence has come from a simple reality. Enormous amounts of energy have very few practical ways out of the Gulf. But if countries spend years building alternative pipelines, terminals, storage, suppliers, shipping routes, and energy systems, that dependence can gradually weaken. And the result would not be a world without chokepoints. It would be a world with more of them, spread across a larger network, with no single route carrying quite the same weight. That means the real shift would not happen on the water. It would happen in the calculations made by governments, companies, and energy buyers. Instead of asking whether Hormuz can be kept open, they could start asking how much of the system can function without it. And once that question has a credible answer, the strategic value of the strait begins to change. Hormuz would still be important. It would still carry energy. It would still matter to the countries around it. But it would no longer be indispensable. And that may be the most powerful way for a chokepoint to lose its power. Not by being closed, by becoming replaceable.